podcast for unlocking potential by and with Uli Vogel. A warm welcome to everyone to our episode today, to our latest show. And I've brought along a fantastic guest, someone I've actually known for a really long time. And we're going to talk about a red-hot topic, more on that in just a moment. Joining me here today is Richard Lutz. Ricky, as I've always known him, his nickname since childhood. Ricky, it's really great to have you here. A warm welcome.
A warm welcome to you too, dear Uli. I hope it's all right if I call you Uli. That's how I've known you since we were kids. We've known each other since our school days.
Very nice. Ricky, and now we're getting started today, taking a bit of a pointed look at one or two topics. I'll get right to it. Explain how we structured things. To start, we'll take a bit of a look at you and me, so the listeners can get to know you as well, to develop a bit of a story. And at the beginning, I'll share a bit about you, and you'll tell us a bit about how you ended up where you are today. We're both entrepreneurs, so to speak, but we each found our own way to get here. And the second snippet, so to speak, is that we'll take a look at values and wealth management. So, how can you actually bring it all together and get to the point, what really matters in wealth management in terms of values? Basically, what it all comes down to, it really is a sensitive topic, and you're our expert here as a wealth manager. That would be point 2. And the third snippet, the third thumbnail, so to speak, is that we'll take a look at the topic of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and take a bit of a critical look at it because it's always marketed really well, to put it that way. But not everything is gold that glitters. Not everything that glitters is gold. So, in that sense, we want to sharpen things up a bit here, maybe even be a bit polarizing, get people thinking, so you're not just going along with the mainstream. All right, now to your profile, in quotation marks. Yeah, we already mentioned it. We spent our school years together at the Wilhelms Gymnasium in Munich. And then you went into banking and worked at various banks, including UBS, the big Swiss one, so to speak. But you also worked at other banks, smaller ones that people don't really know. One I still remember is Alpenbank. When you were in Munich, I visited you there a few times as well. And then you also worked at asset management firms, including Wamsler, and eventually became self-employed. And yes, you even have your own fund and so on. So, it all went in that direction, leading to you being an independent asset manager today. And now the question is, which might interest the listeners. Okay. How did this path develop? Where were there perhaps a few milestones or crossroads that led you to take this path, and why are you where you are today?
I actually started out very differently. I finished high school, and I don't know how it was for you back then. Did we really know what we wanted to do? I then started studying Japanese studies, but only for 4 semesters. I realized pretty quickly that academia wasn't for me. And of course, it was pretty exciting, Looking back, it was pretty clear why I was so interested in Japan at the time. Because back then, Japan was the economic powerhouse with the strongest growth. If you remember, a skyscraper. In Tokyo, a single skyscraper would have been worth as much as the entire downtown of Munich.
That's how it was back then.
That's how it was back then. And then, of course, my enthusiasm for business. And naturally, my interest in finance led me, logically enough, to start working at a bank. I started out, of course, in the traditional way at Bayerische Vereinsbank. That bank doesn't even exist anymore these days. And then I moved through the various banking positions, but most of the time I shifted from a universal bank towards a more specialized bank, so from a universal or private bank like Bayerische Vereinsbank. Then, through a purely online or telephone bank, I ended up at the world's largest asset manager at the time, UBS. And then, time and again, to smaller firms. Then I moved on to a Liechtenstein bank, the VP Bank, a small but very distinguished investment house. After that, I went to the Alpen Bank you already mentioned because I simply feel more comfortable in smaller organizations. That's because the area of responsibility is just bigger there. And of course, you also have direct contact with clients there. And you can really focus more on the actual work. And the next step, of course, is to go fully into specialization, moving exclusively into pure asset management. Not a holistic approach, so not the kind of asset management where you also deal with real estate or take care of business loans and things like that. But really just a specialization in the investment of liquid funds, classical stocks and bonds. Then, of course, the next step, after I had gained some experience there, was to become self-employed with my own asset management company together with my partner, Robert Beets. I think small is good, but you should still have a few people around you so you don't fall into the trap of focusing too much on yourself. You always think you know everything and you can do everything. There is a partner who is also a bit older than me and who has a completely different background. The conversations are very interesting. And of course, that also benefits asset management and, in turn, the clients.
Yes, very good, Ricky, that you brought it up. Maybe for our listeners, most of whom are in a completely different field. And people say, you just go self-employed. I did that too, but I mean, as an asset manager, that's really a huge undertaking. You basically have to get the license. Get it, and you have to go to the Bundesbank, where you told me about it the other day, all the things you have to do, maybe just in 3 or 4 sentences, so people know what's actually involved, because to get a license as an asset manager, I mean, it's right and important that there are hurdles in place. Yeah, because you're managing a lot of money, but maybe you can give our listeners an idea about that.
There is good regulation and bad regulation. This is an example of good regulation, because in the end, a client or a customer can't really know in advance whether the person sitting across the table is actually a trustworthy contact. And that's exactly what BaFin is for, the Federal Financial Supervisory Authority, and of course also the Bundesbank. They've put certain hurdles in place so that, for example, if you want to run an asset management company or start such a business, you have to meet specific requirements. So, of course, experience in the investment sector is necessary. For example, I worked in the field for a long time. I was a portfolio manager, the sole responsible portfolio manager at various banks. And of course, you also need to have leadership experience. That's also a really crucial point. You also need to know how to run a company, meaning the basic principles of entrepreneurship, and be familiar with them as well. And only once you've proven that, along with a certain reputation check that takes place, which is important, can you call yourself an asset manager here in Germany. Not just anyone can do that. Normally, that's quite a high hurdle. Break time equals 0.5s/, and the process can easily take 6 to 9 months to complete. We're lucky. In Bavaria, things are a bit more personal. Back then, I simply went to the Bundesbank and, in the end, I didn't tell them I wanted to open an asset management firm. Instead, I asked them how I could do it in the fastest way possible, and they guided me through the whole process. They even helped draft some of the correspondence with BaFin. I also got in touch with BaFin myself fairly soon after that. I think I was the only asset manager who flew to Frankfurt to meet BaFin before even founding the company. And I actually sat with them in the cafeteria just to get to know the people there. And when you do that, the result is that instead of waiting 6 to 9 months, I think it was 4 weeks, in 4 weeks, we got the approval.
That's probably a record, and I think that leads us right into our next point. Because it really comes down to interpersonal relationships and values. Of course, you told me, you also gave talks there, sharing your expertise and so on. So you give, but you also like to receive. And that's how it's been for you over the decades, as I understand it, whether you were at Alpenbank, VR Bank, or now working independently. And so on, you've had really long-standing, decades-long client relationships. And that's exactly what stands out with an asset manager. Everyone immediately thinks, yes, that's the man I've trusted for decades, and that's my money I'm entrusting to him, and so on. That's where it becomes obvious. But really, in all businesses, you have to say, this point is absolutely central. Among us advisors, there's sometimes this saying, a bit tongue-in-cheek, in the end, everyone gets the clients they deserve. And that's exactly what's meant by it. Of course. And maybe now this leads us to our second point, where we focus for a moment. So, what are the core values in wealth management? Sure, you could maybe narrow it down to 1 or 2, but maybe we can go for 3, 4, or 5, just to round things out a bit and say, from your perspective, since you really have decades of experience there, what would you say are the truly important values in wealth management, Vicky?
Aside from the values that every company needs to have, like simply being good at what they do, having solid craftsmanship, in wealth management, it's especially about being able to build trust. So, on the one hand, it's about showing trust towards the client as well, which means really listening to them for a long time, responding to their needs, and sometimes also being honest and saying that certain things just aren't possible. Or sometimes you just realize that you're simply not the right business partner. And on the other hand, of course, it's also about the client being able to rely on the fact that what was agreed upon in these conversations, things like wishes, investment goals, risk preferences, and personal expectations are all set individually, and these can change over time, will be respected in how their money is managed. And ultimately, he gives us the power of attorney to do this for him. He can, and this is the second important point, of course transparently track every transaction. The days are gone when the client would come by once a year and say, I'll take a look at my portfolio. Now, of course, with online access and the internet, it's a whole different story. It's only natural that you can check in on it every day. But of course, trust means for someone who invests money with an asset manager, that they don't have to, that they don't need to check in every day. That's a really important point. The second thing is credibility. Credibility means that there are areas in business where you have to be a bit of a loud promoter. Sometimes you just have to put the cow on the market and sell it. That's completely counterproductive when it comes to asset management. So, never promise anything you can't deliver. That's an extremely important point. You know, there are these, maybe you've noticed it too, there are these so-called return crooks who claim you can double your money in a year or even in a month. And once again, I somehow made 4,000% because I bought Nvidia when it was at rock bottom. And of course, I bought Bitcoin when it was $8. So all these things you hear, if you mention something like that once or twice, something that sounds like you're trying to time the market, the client will definitely remember it. And when things really don't go well for a while, because everyone goes through a rough patch at some point, when you just don't get the returns you or the client were hoping for, and that you actually want to deliver, that's when it gets interesting, because your credibility really helps you during those times. And that's also a really important point, courage. You need to have the courage not to constantly talk to your client about your successes. Most of my clients, I actually only talk to them once every 6 months or so, when we have a longer conversation. Otherwise, it's only really in-depth when something isn't going well.
I think so.
That's how it goes. Yeah, sometimes it gets to the point where, when I call, the client says, oh no. Now I'm hearing from you again, but I can imagine that's not a good sign. Of course, that's meant as a joke. But that's what builds trust and helps you get through tougher times together. I
recently listened to an interview with another asset manager, and he also said that real quality only shows when everything is going down. And how you manage the negative spiral, so to speak, when things are really going well. That's really the case everywhere, if we're being honest. It's easy to be a fair-weather captain, but stepping in when things get tough, when the storm is coming, that's not so simple. That's why I also think this point about courage is a good one in this case. So, courage. To bring this transparency and also to communicate the negative side. But otherwise, let's say, it's not that different from other businesses, as you also mentioned. And here, it's simply something, a sensitive asset, that's just the way it is. It's not a consumer good or a direct, major investment good like machinery or something similar. Instead, it's money, and money has always had a bit of a mystique to it, and in that sense, I really like how you brought that out. You did. And if that's all right with you, Ricky, I'd actually like to move on to ESG now, because that's a really important aspect when it comes to influencing the mindset of investors or even introducing regulations. And now I'd like to take a moment to define the term ESG a little bit for our listeners. In quotation marks, define it. It stands for environmental, so the environment. Then the S stands for social aspects. And then the G is for governance, that means corporate governance. And just for fun, before our interview, I asked ChatGPT and set up a proper prompt. And said, let's get straight to the point now. And I'll just quickly tell you what I found out. And then we'll dive into the discussion. So, ESG are criteria by which companies assess their sustainability and social responsibilities. So, environmental, the environment, refers to aspects like energy efficiency and carbon dioxide emissions. Of course, social includes relationships with employees and communities, and also covers issues of social justice. And governance is about corporate management and transparency. And ethical behavior is also a big part of that. And now, ChatGPT says, well, ESG is important for investors because it affects a company's long-term financial performance. Yeah, for now, that's just how it's being put. Companies that take ESG criteria seriously minimize risks, improve their reputation, and gain the trust of investors. Customers are also increasingly preferring sustainable companies. Legal developments and standards are making ESG more and more relevant for companies. That sounds great. You can almost picture it. And one last paragraph. Companies should pay attention to ESG in order to stay competitive and ensure long-term success. It promotes responsibility, encourages innovation, and strengthens relationships with all stakeholders. ESG helps to shape corporate culture and to drive positive change in the economy. So, maybe this is an example of why we shouldn't just blindly trust ChatGPT, but that's just how it spits it out for now. And now, Ricky, I'd say it's your turn to kick things off. You also sent me quite a bit of data in advance. And we already talked about these topics last week anyway. So let's toss some ideas back and forth and sharpen things up a bit, because the way I just put it, it all sounds a bit rosy. How do you see it?
Earlier, I talked about good regulation, and this is an example of bad regulation. The background is that, as part of its Green Deal and Sustainable Finance Action Plan, the EU is pushing to direct capital flows into ESG, to steer them in that direction. There's even a new buzzword for this. Maybe I should introduce that as well. It's called SRI. That stands for Socially Responsible Investing, meaning investing according to these 3 criteria. And the EU envisions that it can also qualify investment in this regard. In other words, investments should be made according to these criteria. It also has to be proven that these investments are actually being made. And it must also be demonstrated that the criteria are being met. On the one hand, by the companies being invested in, and on the other hand, by those who are investing or providing products for these investments. And unfortunately, in practice, this doesn't work at all. In the financial world, there's always what's called a rating for things like this. You might know it from government bonds, like a AAA rating, for example. Germany still has a AAA rating. America now only has a single A. That shows you that government debt in America is higher than in Germany. This allows both investors and asset managers to see which investment carries a higher risk. So, AAA means no risk. A already means a bit more risk. And this rating system was also introduced for SRI, that is, for socially responsible investing. And some surprising things come out of that. Let's put it this way. What do BB, an oil company, BHP, one of the largest mining and gold producers, Vale, the biggest iron ore producer, have in common? And Rio Tinto, the major metal, gold, and aluminium producer, all of them have an A rating. The best ESG rating. That shows you that it's not really possible to invest sustainably just by relying on these ratings.
What can we do?
In the end, the problem is once again in the details. The regulations are so strict that the companies subject to them, that is, the financial sector, the producers like fund companies, and on the other side, the intermediaries such as asset managers, want to minimize risk so much that they absolutely avoid violating any regulatory oversight, which is incredibly tight. So in the end, when it comes to investing in these social, sustainable investments, there are 4 criteria. The negative criterion, that one's pretty straightforward. Simply put, you just state what you don't invest in. The classic example, of course, is the arms industry, then oil, and maybe even things like child labor. And so on and so forth. The second criterion would be the positive approach. So, you only invest in companies that, so to speak, have a positive impact on sustainability, good corporate governance, and social justice. That's also what is promised by impact investing. That's the last term I want to mention in this context now.
But it's already quite interesting.
And the third, of course, is part of the set of criteria. That's engagement. So, for example, companies that are strongly represented on supervisory boards or at shareholder meetings. A classic example is BlackRock, which is now the largest asset manager in the world.
Yeah.
Of course, since they're invested in an incredible number of stocks and therefore also hold larger percentage stakes. And that's why, at shareholder meetings, they can of course also demand changes to company policy, specifically towards sustainability, social responsibility, and good corporate governance. And then there's the fourth approach, which is the best-in-class approach. The best-in-class approach simply means that you take, from the various sectors, like defense companies, oil companies, mining companies, or even
textiles,
IT companies, textiles, whatever it may be, you pick the top 10 that just barely meet the criteria the best. And this set of criteria is used almost exclusively when it comes to awarding ratings within the framework of ESG. And that's how it happens, of course, that a company like BP gets an A, because among all the oil exploration companies in the world, it simply does the best job. Still within the framework of ESG. But it's pretty clear that all of this really has nothing to do with ESG anymore, and I think we can all agree on that.
Oh my goodness, yeah. So, that's kind of a bit of a sham, in quotation marks, because not the whole set of criteria is being used, but only one, which then, relatively speaking, actually shows a distorted picture, to put it that way. To me, it really seems like, especially in Europe, the main approach is, you have to, you should, and if you meet this and that requirement, then, and so on, then it's okay. When I look across the pond, and we talked about this last time too, I see things differently in the US, and I don't want to glorify them or anything. And so, you have to look at everything critically, but I see it as more supply-oriented, you know, like, yeah. They do things in certain sectors, but not everything is checked by a bunch of bureaucrats. Instead, if something gets done, there are tax breaks and similar incentives. And you recently mentioned an example that seemed pretty wild to me, about how many bureaucrats were hired in Rome to check something or other. I can't even remember exactly what it was. So if we compare things on a European level and maybe with North America, what's your takeaway from that?
The example you just brought up is actually a really good one to use. It shows how planned economies just don't work. There's not a single example in history where a planned economy has worked. The biggest abuse of a planned economy, we all know it, was the Soviet Union, and we all know how that turned out. A smaller example is during the COVID era. If you remember, there were an incredible number of large COVID relief packages handed out. The biggest one, relative to economic strength, was in Italy. Italy received billions in COVID relief funds. And to be honest, they knew exactly how they were going to spend the money. And by the way, only about 30% of those COVID relief funds have actually been paid out so far. We're talking about almost 4 years now that these COVID relief funds have been in the pipeline. The example you're mentioning keeps coming up in the media because municipalities could apply to receive COVID relief funds. And a small mountain village in Italy also, so to speak, successfully won this tender. This little mountain village has fewer than 50 residents, but received 50 million euros.
Wow.
And in fact, out of those 50 million euros, 5 million euros have already been drawn down. But by no means did the village do this itself. Instead, a ministerial subcommittee was set up in Italy to examine how the funds could now be used for this small village. And setting up this authority cost 5 million euros.
Wow, so we can really take a look at this and ask ourselves, seriously, how is it possible that we end up with so much bureaucracy? And ultimately, that's also something that eventually trains people out of taking personal responsibility. So, for me, that would be the next point. In business, in society, and in politics, we keep coming across labels. And then it's said, this is good, and it's marketed that way too. And talked about. But really, at some point, we end up losing our common sense. Or, to put it very provocatively, what do these labels actually achieve? We're talking about ESG now, and you've mentioned a few other things as well. If we extrapolate that, or if we really take a critical look at what consequences it has, what are they? What are your thoughts?
This centrally planned approach has several negative consequences. If you just look at it from an economic perspective, the money is now being channeled in a direction that focuses exclusively on ESG. That means, of course, for companies operating outside this ESG radius, they receive less funding or invest less. Keyword: energy independence. All oil companies in Europe and, even to some extent in America, are no longer investing at all in renewing, maintaining, or expanding their business models. Because they say, within the framework of ESG, for one thing, it's almost impossible now. You can't get loans for it anymore. And secondly, it's also not wanted. Politically, it's not desired. Which of course leads to the fact that, in the end, the extraction of these fossil fuels takes place exclusively in countries where we know that the standards, specifically the standards of governance, good corporate management, and social justice, do not exist in any way. A classic example of this is the image of our Minister of Economic Affairs, Habeck, who has to bow before the King of Qatar. In the end, this goes against ESG criteria because, among other things, one of the subpoints under social justice is that you can't do business with autocrats or countries that do not respect human rights. You can see that this dynamic, which does not rely on personal responsibility or its own logic, leads to economic damage being done in the EU. And that has a moral component. Because economic damage always means that less money is earned, less is produced, and ultimately, prosperity. And, of course, the implementation of social justice as well keeps getting less and less. And that's the moral component of this failure of a planned economy. In the end, it's like this: trying to do good or wanting to create something good doesn't always automatically lead to something good.
You put that nicely.
That's exactly what Faust says, or rather, what Mephistopheles is made to say, the other way around. He is the spirit who always wants evil and yet always creates good. In the end, what we have here is a reversal of Mephistopheles' guiding principle. But what I'm getting at is that this isn't just a classic economic issue. In my opinion, it's also an ethical one. You know Yuval Noah Harari. We've talked about him a few times, and I think he's really worth reading. And, for example, he once said, I'll just translate it right away. Morality doesn't mean following divine commandments. It means reducing suffering. And right now, the morality of ESG and planned economies is the commandment. To fight climate change, everything has to be subordinated to that. And the suffering, the economic upheavals, maybe even the lack of social security in old age. All of that falls by the wayside, and that can't be moral.
It's doctrinaire, that's just how it sounds, and it's imposed from above. And sure, these aren't exactly pleasant facts, but we always have to make sure we don't fall into bashing. Instead, we should also look at the upside. We really need to see that as well. So, what can we actually do? What can each individual do? Of course, we have the framework conditions as they are. And you could also show some leniency towards politics and say, well, good intentions are often the opposite of good. But then you have to set that aside at some point and ask, what can I do now? How can I, in your specific area of responsibility, you're a wealth manager and so on, how can I personally make sure that I go in my direction as competently or as well as possible, yes, it's about personal responsibility and self-sufficiency, and not about relying on the government. So, if you're counting on the government when you're older, it's going to be tough. What can you do? What are your recommendations? Now, especially for the self-employed, many of our listeners are self-employed. What are some important aspects?
For the asset manager, the situation is such that, in the end, he doesn't apply the criteria when putting together the portfolio, simply because, for him, the criteria aren't understandable. You end up having to explain yourself if you use criteria that you know from the start are actually wrong. So, in a way, it's just critical to deal with the requirements and, as much as possible, not to apply them. That's a really key point. The second point, of course, is what can you do yourself? Of course, you can also simply raise awareness within your own company, or, to use the modern term, within your community, if you like, family, friends, business partners, and help spread this idea. Because the fundamental social contract that needs to be made, that climate change must be fought, should really be beyond dispute. The problem, of course, is when this project is currently so flawed and therefore leads to faulty results, it could ultimately cause this, how should I put it, this collective societal effort to fade so far into the background that fighting climate change no longer has any priority at all, or maybe even gets turned on its head. So, with the attitude of, that's just another story, that's just another fairy tale, that's just some wording, that's just some framing, and all the other things you hear out there, in the grand scheme of things.
Populists. Well,
I don't see it as that big of a deal. I do see it as a big deal, this approach of centralizing power. Of course, I'm critical of it, the planned economy aspect. But in psychology, they talk about the 4 stages or spaces of change. And it always starts at the beginning. You probably know this. I can imagine that in HR. In the field where you work, maybe it's a bit of a cliché too. It has become by now. It all always starts in a state of bliss. We're doing something against the injustice in the world, and especially against climate change. That's the first stage, bliss. And the second is denial. That means criticisms come up like the ones we've just discussed and talked about here. And that's just a small part of it. But people just deny it. They say it's not true. They say the energy just needs to be stored, that's all, so that it works. We can produce green hydrogen to make it work. Of course, that's nonsense. Of course, that's nonsense. I mean, the loss when charging and discharging a lithium-ion battery is 5%. The loss during the electrolysis of hydrogen is 75%. That can't be changed. That's denial. And then you end up in the state that we're slowly entering. And that's what psychologists call confusion. Everything just gets chaotic. And then, even in this confusion, you're expected not to lose sight of the bigger picture. So, saying that the EU is a centrally planned economy is wrong. This particular approach is centrally planned and doesn't work. The EU itself is not a centrally planned approach. Take the fairy tales about soft energy, for example, or the capacity factors of solar. I mean, solar can never provide 100% of the energy every day simply because, well, there's day and night. It can only be 50% at most. So these are just basic truisms. That's obviously clear. But despite all that, the big goal is still to live in a world in the future where the climate is at least somewhat bearable. But we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And thank goodness, psychology tells us that after confusion, and that's still to come, renewal follows. And in the end, it's this renewal that actually works and will happen. Of course, there will be a global effort worldwide to fight climate change on the one hand. That's one side of it. And on the other hand, of course, to also take measures so that we can live with the changes in climate. But all of this can only work. In my opinion, it can only work through a social interplay of personal responsibility, personal initiative, and also critical thinking, while at the same time, of course, having supranational rules and efforts. It's completely logical, whether it's in Germany or elsewhere. Whether 17% or 70% of cars are electric in Germany makes absolutely no difference to the global climate.
So, we really need to make sure that, as Germans or as Germany, we properly understand our role in the world. But you put it very nicely, the renewal. And I mean, you can just look at history, and Harari does that brilliantly as well. It's great that you mentioned him. You did. If we look at the so-called Dark Ages, and then, at some point, the Renaissance happened, and we came out of it. And so, there is the possibility, through human cooperation. You just have to be careful that demagoguery doesn't get out of hand, that we keep our common sense, that each of us keeps a realistic eye on social issues and doesn't just dream. Chasing after promises. Like, everything will be fine here. And if we just dictate things from the top, it'll all work out. So I think we've explained in a really nice, especially your way, how it all fits together. And that's why I think we've gone from the topic of wealth management to a broad range of global issues, with ESG, of course, at the center. And Ricky, maybe as a closing word from your side, what's your outlook? What's your outlook now? For, let's say, 2024 and beyond, if we sum up this topic.
I think we'll continue to seem a bit confused. When it comes to implementing measures for climate change, that will certainly drag on for quite some time. Forgive me for not giving any time frames, because that's tough to say overall. You know, there are two types of forecasters. Those who know nothing, and those who don't know that they know nothing. That's why I think making predictions is always a bit tricky. But I assume that the basic idea, which is correct, that the climate crisis needs to be mitigated in some way, will prevail. And that, for the most part, action needs to be taken against it, that in the end. This common sense. will prevail on the one hand, and on the other hand, that reason will also win out. That the centrally planned economic approach, which is historically outdated, actually does more harm than good. And until then, until that's put into practice, it's just going to take a few more years. But before we started the conversation, we briefly talked about Spain.
And
Uli, you wouldn't have believed that youth unemployment in Spain would be cut in half within 4 or 5 years either. If we had said that 3 or 4 years ago, everyone would have thought it couldn't happen. That means, just as things are going in the wrong direction now, it can be turned around just as quickly and go the other way. And that will definitely happen, because up to now, the history of humanity has actually been marked by many setbacks, but ultimately, it's a tremendous success story that the world has developed so much in just a few millennia.
great, there's hardly anything more to add. Afterwards, you could say, things just go in waves, but you also have to look at the overall trend. And I'd like to wrap up, Ricky, with a quote from the comedian Carl Valentin, who's also from our hometown, and who once put it very nicely, predictions are really difficult, especially when they're about the future. And with that, I think everything's been said. Ricky, I want to thank you so much for being here and joining us, and for sharing your perspectives with us. It was incredibly valuable. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see each other again very soon.
Uli, I'd also like to thank you for inviting me to the podcast. And it was a really fascinating conversation. We can definitely do this again sometime, or even continue privately.
Very good, Ricky. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
See you later. Bye.